Everyone, thank you so much for joining us. My name is Savannah Sherman. I'm the chair of the Animal Law section of the Hawaii State Bar Association. And today we are very honored and excited to be joined by Professor Hira Jaleel. Her background in this area is impressive, to say the least. So she does her research and scholarship with a focus on international animal law, industrial animal agricultural law, food law, and aquatic animal law. She's very involved in the animal law community. Right now, she's the co-chair of the Wildlife Subcommittee for the American Bar Association. She's previously served as the vice chair of publications for the subcommittee, and as well as the vice chair of programs for the International Animal Law Subcommittee of the Animal Law section. I'm sorry, of the International Law section. She's also on the board of the Aquatic Life Institute, and her work in animal law beyond this has been very impressive as well. She's worked with a law firm in Pakistan on multiple animal cases, dealing with issues with evictions when there are pets involved, in animal abuse cases, and as well as helping to advise animal nonprofits. And impressively, she's also worked to end the culling of street dogs in Pakistan and instead replace this practice with a more humane trap, neuter, release, and vaccinate program. At the end of our presentation today as well, we'll be hearing from Inga Gibson. She works with Pono Advocacy, and she's going to talk about how you can get involved in helping to prevent or end octopus farming here in Hawaii. So without further ado, I'll pass the mic off. So thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you so much, Savannah, and good afternoon, everyone. I want to start off by thanking the Hawaii State Bar Association Animal Law section for having me here to talk about octopus farming. Of course, today I'm talking about the legal, scientific, and ethical concerns of octopus farming. And I'll kind of discuss a little bit about where the law and policy debate is headed, especially the wave of preemptive bans that aim to stop octopus farming before it really takes root in the United States and in other parts of the world. I apologize. I'm going to be looking a little bit in this direction because my slides are actually here and my notes are on the screen. So apologies for that. So let's dive into it. Here's the agenda for today. We'll start off with the scientific foundation, of course, what we mean when we say octopuses are sentient and why that matters. What is octopus farming? So what is the industry proposal for industrial octopus aquaculture? The main categories of harms: animal welfare, environmental, public health. The proposed solution, of course, which is preemptive bans on octopus farming, national and state legislation. And then also, I want to engage a little bit with the arguments both for and against preemptive bans because, it's not always that clear cut, and it's always a good idea to engage with the other side of the issue as well. So it's a long agenda, and I'm going to try and keep it as short and engaging as possible. So with that, let's start this policy, let's start where the policy conversation starts, which is octopus sentience. So, um, when you hear sentience, you might think that we're just talking about like we're in the realm of philosophy, right? Or even you might even think if you're a hardcore animal advocate, and I'm very sympathetic to that position, that we should just assume all animals are sentient and that, it's low-key, even insulting to even have this conversation. But in animal lawmaking, sentience is really important, right? Because it's increasingly treated as a threshold question. Is there strong evidence that this animal species can experience pain, distress, or other negative states, right? And if yes, the legal system tends to treat the animal's suffering as a harm worth considering. Not always, but sometimes. But sentience tends to be the threshold question. And if we can scientifically demonstrate that an animal is sentient, is cognitively complex, this can go a long way in influencing law and policy. So a great example here is the 2021 evidence review commissioned in the United Kingdom and produced by a group of researchers at the London School of Economics. I'll refer to it as the LSE report that analyzed over 300 studies on cephalopod mollusks, which include octopuses, and decapod crustaceans, which include crabs and shrimp, to examine to figure out if there's enough evidence in the scientific literature for sentience. And for cephalopod mollusks, which is relevant for us today, the authors concluded that there's a strong evidence of sentience. And also for decapod crustaceans, not so relevant today, but you might be interested. The scientists concluded that, or the researchers concluded that there is strong evidence of sentience in true crabs, and substantial evidence for others, but less than that for true crabs, while also noting that a lack of evidence is not evidence of absence, and that it's just because not enough scientific research has been done on some animals. So we can't say for sure if there's enough hallmarks, if there are enough hallmarks of sentience there. This study was fairly groundbreaking, right? Because I think it really put cephalopod mollusks and decapod crustaceans on the legal map, right? So not like I think with documentaries like My Octopus Teacher, octopuses were kind of already in the public consciousness, but now the law is aware of them as well. And this study did have policy impact. So in the UK, cephalopod mollusks and decapod crustaceans were explicitly included in the UK Animal Welfare Sentience Act of 2022, which informs the scope of the government's animal welfare policy work. So we see that the sentience research translated into actual policy. But so what do I even mean, right? You might be wondering, what do I mean when I say that octopuses are sentient? What does that look like, right? Well, firstly, let's talk about cognition and problem solving. Octopuses demonstrate complex learning, memory, and problem solving capacities. They can navigate environments, they can use tools, they can solve puzzles, and they're able to adapt their behavior based on past experiences, which obviously, also demonstrates a capacity for long-term memory. And these traits in animal welfare science often correlate with more severe welfare compromise under intensive confinement. So when we're talking about octopus farming, the fact that octopuses are cognitively complex means that they can suffer more in captivity. Then we have pain and negative effect. The question really, when we talk about sentience, isn't whether octopuses have the ability to feel pain, because many animals and many living beings do have the ability to feel pain, like reflexive pain. But for sentience, we have to go a step further and have to see whether the evidence supports the inference that pain is experienced as an aversive state in a way that drives learning and behavior, right? So, like this pain is pain accompanied by some emotion? Is the animal learning something from that pain? And the LSE review lays out criteria for pain and negative effect in cephalopods and then finds strong evidence supporting sentience against those markers. Then we have behavior, right? Behavioral needs. Octopuses are, all species, I think, are special. Octopuses are also special. They're the kind or the species of octopuses most commonly discussed to be farmed tend to be solitary, they tend to be exploratory, they're highly responsive to environmental complexity. And this matters, right? Because when we're talking about farming them and we're talking about keeping them in intensive confinement, the welfare harms won't necessarily arise from just injury to the animals, but also from just the fact that they are used to engaging with their environment and behaving in a way that they won't be able to do in confinement. So we can begin to. So of course, I mean, there are many books written about how complex octopuses are, how intelligent they are. So it's not even possible for me to get into all the science. So I'm just going to stop there and kind of just end with saying that or end this part of my presentation by saying that we can begin to see now why sentience matters for the law, because the stronger the evidence of sentience, the higher the justification burden for creating an industrial system that will predictably generate suffering, particularly when we're talking about producing an end product, which is like octopus, food products, which are not necessary for human survival, and the harms cannot be reliably mitigated, and which are all problems with octopus farming. Um, and here I also want to frame kind of my thesis for today, which is that when we talk about suffering or when we talk about harm for farmed animals or in industrial agriculture settings, there's generally two ways for legislatures to respond, right? When there is a credible risk of welfare or other kinds of harms. One way is to regulate the practice or industry, and regulation with like enforceable welfare standards. The second way is to prohibit the activity from the get-go if standards are not realistically achievable or if they're not enforceable at the scale that the farming is going to happen at. And I want you to keep these two options in mind as I kind of go through the rest of my presentation because we'll come back to this thesis. So what is octopus farming and what are current plans for octopus aquaculture? Octopus farming refers to raising octopuses in controlled systems for human consumption. Historically, octopuses are currently consumed as food, and but they're not farmed. They're usually wild caught. So when we're talking about farming them, we're talking about raising juveniles to slaughter weight in captive conditions. And the proposed model is intensive, it's high output, and and the general idea is that it's going to happen either in land-based tanks or recirculating systems. And what put octopus farming on the map is a Spanish company's proposal. So this Spanish company is called Nueva Pescanova, and they proposed to start, so they had a proposal to start an industrial octopus aquaculture facility in the Canary Islands in Spain, and started pursuing environmental approvals from the government for this facility. And, of course, as part of that process, they had to define or describe what they were planning to do exactly with these octopuses and with these animals. And their plan was to produce 3,000 metric tons of octopus per year. And, unfortunately, when we talk about aquatic animals consumed for food, we don't even refer to them as individuals. We refer to them in just their weight, usually because they're really small and there's lots of them. But if we're trying to try and translate that into individuals, we're talking about roughly 1 million individual octopuses per year. So that's a lot. And the most recent development on the Nueva Pescanova approval process is that the project, so initially what the company wanted to do was to have this kind of expedited form of environmental review. The government, however, rejected the simplified environmental review process because the government concluded that the project could have significant environmental impacts. Of course, the government didn't, reach this conclusion by itself. There was lots of activism around it. There were lots of advocates really pushing for the government to take this planned facility more seriously. And so now, the project isn't dead in the water, but it will require a more exhaustive environmental review. So, but the good news is that as of the end of 2025, early 2026, there's no operating commercial octopus farm producing at an industrial scale, even though there is a significant interest and research aimed at making it feasible. And the proposals we're going to talk about today are all preemptive, so they're not addressing a facility that currently exists. But Spain is pretty far. So kind of bringing things closer to home. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the Kanaloa Octopus Farm from Hawaii. So this farm operated at the Hawaii Ocean Science and Technology Park. It was established, I believe, in 2015, and it described itself as an education and research facility. This facility claimed to be rescuing octopuses from fisherfolk, but after activists visited the facility, as well as when whistleblowers started reporting from within the facility, people who were working there, the reports indicated that they were actually illegally catching day octopuses without proper permits, and there was also regular mismanagement and ill treatment of these octopuses. They would escape their tanks. There would regularly be low water in tanks. They would often kill older octopuses to make room for new ones. I believe one of the activists who did the most work on this facility noted that no one octopus survived past 13 days at this facility, and that's like 1-3. So in early 2023, the Hawaii Department of Land and Natural Resources got involved, took notice of the facility's role in the capture, possession, and handling of the Hawaiian day octopus. And because of the controversy surrounding the facility and because of, their violations and how they were sourcing these animals, the facility ultimately shut down in 2023. So I believe it's no longer operational. So, when we think about why is octopus farming even being proposed? Why do we even want to farm these animals? I believe the typical industry rationale would go something like this, right? There's rising demand for octopus products as there is for pretty much every animal product. There's a high market price that these products fetch, so they're, lucrative. And also this environmental rationale that by farming octopuses, we'll be alleviating pressure on wild octopus fisheries. But I think to kind of zoom out a little bit, we have to look at the overall feasibility of octopus farming. We have to examine the biological reality of, who are these animals we're trying to farm and what kinds of systems are we trying to farm them in, right? Octopuses are carnivorous, they're behaviorally complex, and, I talked about how they're solitary, they're prone to aggression and confinement. So, this makes them an unusually poor fit for intensive high density farming. And it means that there are lots of environmental, public health, and animal welfare considerations that we need to discuss when we talk about octopus farming. And which also makes them very distinct from, say, farming algae or seaweed. So let's start with the animal welfare implications of octopus farming. Before I really get into these to the animal welfare implications, I want to preface by saying that as we've already established, a facility that farms octopuses industrially does not exist. So these animal welfare issues are issues that researchers, scientists, activists, advocates believe that are going to be the case regardless of how octopuses are farmed, right? Because the scale at which you need to farm these animals to make octopus farming economically efficient cannot be achieved by also safeguarding welfare. And also because scientifically, we're really not at a point where we even know what welfare looks like. And I'll get into that in a bit. So starting off with low environmental enrichment, we've talked about how octopuses have evolved to be, live in complex, really stimulating marine environments. And of course, intensive tank systems are not that. They tend to be relatively barren. Maybe they'll throw in like a toy or two at max. And again, that's also for like facilities like the Kanaloa facility, which was kind of a petting zoo for octopuses. Like in an industrial farming facility, there's really no incentive for producers to provide environmental enrichment, right? So this obviously will create a welfare risk for animals who have not been domesticated for centuries. They're used to living in really enriched environments. Um, in fact, a 2022 analysis associated with the LSE report authors described octopus farming as a bleak environment, characterized by barren tanks and unavoidable close proximity to humans and other octopuses, which directly contradicts, their species specific behavior. Then we have high rates of cannibalism and aggression. The main species of octopus that is being proposed to be farmed, they're often solitary and confinement, and when they're forced to live in tanks together, confinement can provoke aggression. They can cause octopuses to cannibalize each other. And this is something that the welfare literature on this issue repeatedly emphasizes. Then we have handling, transport, and veterinary realities. They're physiologically very sensitive animals. It's very easy to injure an octopus if you're trying to handle them. So handling and transport, which are both features of industrial animal agriculture, can be highly stressful. And also, veterinary standards for cephalopods, they don't really exist the same way they do for like terrestrially farmed animals like cows or chickens or pigs, right? And as a result of all these things, you're going to have a system where there's very little limited capacity for individualized care and probably not even enough like specialization or enough specialized knowledge for individualized care for these animals. One of the most important aspects, one of the most important reasons why octopus farming is so problematic is because there's no widely accepted, standardized, scalable humane slaughter method for octopuses. So there are some proposed methods which include chilling, putting them on an ice slurry. And those methods are, very controversial exactly because they're inhumane. They risk prolonged distress before animals eventually die. And there really isn't right now any slaughter method that's been deemed to be humane for octopuses. And before I move on to environmental concerns, I do want to say that I I want to underscore as animal lawyers because we're in, before the animal law section. Um, we already know that it's really difficult to ensure welfare in farmed settings, even for species who have been farmed for centuries at this point, right? You need definable welfare standards. You need to be able to measure what welfare looks like. How would you measure it against whatever standards you have? And you also need regulators that are willing to enforce those standards. And octopus farming is problematic on all three fronts. We don't have a gold standard for octopus welfare in confinement. Indeed, that standard may not exist at all. We don't even necessarily know how we are going to measure welfare in this undomesticated species. And again, if you're an animal lawyer or you've done any animal law work, you know that enforcement inside private animal farming facilities is historically really poor and has been very limited, even for species who have been farmed for a really long time, including finfish, right? So when we're putting these pieces together, you have on the one hand evidence that these animals are sentient, they're behaviorally complex, they're aggressive in confinement, we don't know how to humanely slaughter them. Essentially, the picture that emerges is that we're proposing industrializing the confinement of, animals who are very sentient, very behaviorally complex, and this will predictably generate a lot of suffering, right? But that's not it. It's not just about, of course, I believe it should be just about the octopuses, but even it's not even just about them. There are also serious environmental concerns associated with octopus farming, such as feed and resource use. Octopuses are carnivores. So that means when you're farming them large scale, you're going to require significant inputs of other aquatic animals, which will happen in the form of fish meal or other animal-based feeds. And then from a ecological standpoint, and we talked about how one of the rationales for maybe farming octopuses is that, well, octopus fisheries are collapsing. But if you're farming a carnivorous marine animal, this might actually end up increasing pressure on wild fisheries, if not wild octopus fisheries, then other wild fisheries, rather than reduce that pressure. Then we have waste management, which is again not a feature specific to octopus farming, but a feature specific to intensive animal farming. In that, when you have a lot of animals confined in a small space, of course, you're going to have waste. You're going to have uneaten feed. You're going to have feces. You're going to have nitrogen and phosphorus loads. So even when we're using recirculating systems, as is proposed for octopus farming, waste has to be managed. That waste has to go somewhere, right? It won't just disappear into thin air. And how octopus farming facilities are going to effectively manage effluent impacts and ecosystem impacts is not entirely clear at this point. Then we have escapes. And, if you know anything about octopuses, you know that they are famously known to be escape artists. And so it's not just about, oh, there might be escapes, there probably will be escapes. And again, if you try and compare it to existing forms of aquaculture like salmon farming, escapes happen all the time, and as a result, there is genetic pollution. Escaped salmon end up transferring diseases in the marine ecosystem. So there's like a lot of problems with animals who are essentially being bred to live in captivity. When they end up escaping, they can pretty much wreak havoc on an ecosystem. But if that also wasn't convincing enough, we have public health implications, right? So public health concerns are often, I think, not discussed enough when we talk about this issue, but they're really important. They're really important because, well, firstly, pathogen risk. Aquaculture, again, when you're confining a bunch of animals together, you can have parasites, bacterial infections. You can risk the spread of disease into marine environments. In fact, the legislative proposal in Hawaii's bill, which I know is going to get talked about later today, actually specifically identifies disease transmission risk as one of the reasons why this bill is even being proposed, right? Octopus immune systems, they're not well studied enough for us to even be able to predict what kind of diseases they may be able to spread to other animals or to us as human beings. And so that's like that's a major risk that we wouldn't even know what we're getting into. Then we have antimicrobial resistance, again, a feature of animal farming in general, and not necessarily just for octopus farming, because when you have a lot of animals with weak immune systems confined together, you might need to administer preventative antimicrobials, which can contribute to AMR. And then food safety, because again, like other seafood, like other animal-based proteins, you have or animal-based products, there's always a risk of food safety when we're handling those animals, when we're storing their products or processing them. So not unique to octopuses, but the fact that this is a novel, intensive production system, there's limited welfare knowledge, there's limited veterinary infrastructure. What kind of food safety issues are there going to be? We don't know. Is this a risk we want to take? So the proposed solution that I personally think is also the most effective solution in this case, where we actually don't know a lot, but we do know that there's room for massive suffering and potentially massive environmental and public health implications, is a preemptive ban, right? So, what is a preemptive ban? It's a legislative strategy that says we're not going to wait until the industry exists and we find out what kinds of harms are appearing from that industry. We are going to prohibit it before it starts. And there are a few reasons to buy into preemptive bans as a strategy. The firstly, like I've been saying all this time, is that if there is a risk of serious harm, if there's a risk of serious suffering, serious ecological harm, the state can act before the first facility even opens to like take a precautionary approach, so to speak, right? And to ensure that that severe harm doesn't happen, never materializes. Regulatory infeasibility is a big one. So if, enforceable welfare and environmental standards don't exist, if they're not realistically achievable in a short span of time, which I don't think they are for octopus farming, then, we can't really rely on regulation. Regulation takes a lot of time to to set the infrastructure up and then to perfect it. And with octopus farming, a lot of damage might be done before we even get to a place of effective regulation. And also, it's much easier to achieve a preemptive ban than to ban even one facility after it's already in existence, right? Because then you have all of these economic interests, other interests that have materialized, that are going to make it so much harder to get the industry out, right? So it's much easier to act before anyone really has skin in the game, so to speak, before there are jobs created, before there are animals already being bred, before more research is or money has been sunk into it. So what's going on with federal bans, with preemptive bans on the federal and state level? At the federal level, the main proposal is something called the Octopus Act, which is opposing the cultivation and trade of octopus produced through Unethical Strategies Act. This is an act that was actually, I believe, first introduced in 2024 and then reintroduced in 2025. It essentially tries, or if passed, this law will prohibit the federal authorization of commercial octopus aquaculture in the US, including on US waters and in the US exclusive economic zone, and will also restrict the US from importing commercially farmed octopuses from other parts of the world. So as of today, the bill's just been introduced and referred to the Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation. So, it hasn't really made it hasn't gone out of the committee yet. But the fact that it was introduced and then reintroduced shows that there's at least some federal appetite or some lawmakers who want to prevent a commercial octopus farming industry from gaining a foothold in the US. On the state level, however, much more has been achieved. So, Washington is a pretty landmark jurisdiction because it enacted the first explicit octopus aquaculture prohibition, House Bill 1153, passed and became effective on June 6, 2024, and it prohibits octopus aquaculture in the state. If you look at this slide, you'll see that the date on this article is it's from today, because Washington is also now considering adding on to its existing ban. So its existing ban is just on octopus aquaculture, so it's on private producers who want to farm octopuses. And now there's a bill that's, I believe it's passed the House already in Washington, to outlaw the sale, possession, transport, and distribution of farmed octopuses as well. Then we have California. California enacted a ban on octopus aquaculture, which went into effect Jan 1, 2025, which makes it unlawful to engage in octopus aquaculture for human consumption and also targets commerce in farmed octopus. So this ban is already broader than Washington's ban was. And I personally really like the legislative findings because they really center octopuses and talk about, how they're capable of experiencing great suffering when they're being farmed. Again, going close to home, we have Hawaii. So there are two companion bills in Hawaii that have been considered to prohibit aquaculture, octopus aquaculture for human consumption. The legislative text and the summaries emphasize both ethical concerns but also disease transmission risk, which again is really important. And I'm really happy that Hawaii is paying attention to this aspect of octopus aquaculture specifically. And I know we have someone talking about this shortly as well, so I won't spend too much time here. In Oregon, which is where I live, there actually was a bill, House Bill 2557, introduced in 2025, which would have prohibited raising octopuses for human consumption, and the sale of aquacultured octopus in Oregon. It was referred to the House Committee on Agriculture and Natural Resources. Unfortunately, the bill died in committee because the narrative around the bill, as evidenced by the slide I have up here, became really skewed. And the narrative became like, oh, like the Oregon legislature is trying to ban octopus consumption. It was never a consumption ban. And also that the Oregon Farm Bureau got involved, and the Oregon Farm Bureau was like, we shouldn't be banning. We don't actually know anyone who's doing octopus aquaculture, but we shouldn't be banning any farming before it takes off. So that's why the bill kind of died, and I'm really hoping it gets reintroduced again. There are also other states that have introduced or have considered introducing similar measures. So 3 other states where similar bills to ban octopus farming have been introduced in the US are North Carolina, New Jersey, and New York. And then also in other parts of the world, both Spain and Chile have introduced bills to prohibit octopus farming. And kind of this last piece of my presentation is going to engage with arguments against preemptive bans because there are arguments against them, right? And the 3 arguments that I think are most salient are: one, regulation is better than banning any kind of product. So the claim being that bans are overbroad. Welfare and environmental harms can be mitigated if we just put in enough standards, if we just have enough permitting, if we have enough licensing regimes, if we have enough inspection. Again, looking at the history of how animal use industries have been regulated in the US, that regulation doesn't seem like a great solution. And also the problem with octopus aquaculture, again, I'm sorry for saying this again and again, but if there's one point I want to drive home, it's this, is that the problems are so intrinsic. It's not a matter of like, oh, we can like, if only we have the perfect welfare standards in place, we can farm these animals humanely. Even if like you think it's possible to farm any animal humanely, with octopuses specifically, because they're undomesticated and because, they're very unique in many ways, the problems are very intrinsic, they're very unresolved, and regulation is gonna, even if we do have effective regulation at some time in the future, a lot of damage would have been done before we get to that point. The second argument is that, of course, like the food security argument, we need to feed the world, and also that if we, preemptively ban any industry, we're stifling technological innovation, right? Um, I actually am a little bit partial to the innovation argument, but not in this context, not for octopus farming, but for other industries. For octopus farming, I agree we shouldn't be like willy-nilly banning industries before they really take off the ground. But I think for octopus farming, it's a species-specific judgment we're making about an animal who we have a lot of, evidence of, the animal's cognitive complexity, and this animal being an unusually poor fit for intensive confinement. And also, octopuses are not key for food security, at least here in the U.S., right? So if we're talking about just staying close to home, it's not as big a food security issue um, as some might claim, because octopuses are still considered somewhat a luxury product. This might not be true for everywhere in the world. So, it would obviously have to be examined on a case by case basis. And lastly, the argument of reducing pressure on wild fisheries. I've already engaged with this, but for multiple reasons, the carnivorous nature of octopuses, the empirical uncertainty. We really don't have any evidence that octopus farming is going to alleviate pressure on wild fisheries. It might just add to that pressure. People might still be capturing wild octopuses while farming them at the same time. So, there's really no guarantee that that's going to happen. And I'm going to wrap up, but I did want to, again, bring it. I talked about my octopus teacher in the beginning. I wanted to kind of bring the presentation or bring my talk back to it. I think this film had a lot to do with how the public perceives octopuses, the fact that we have so much advocacy for them, the fact that they have a soft spot in the public's hearts. And I think that the fact that states are moving really quickly, it's a very live contemporary issue, as evidenced by the fact that Washington has literally considered another bill just yesterday, shows that, this is something that we need to actively stay engaged on, and that farming octopuses is a really, really bad idea. So yeah, with that, I'm, open to taking questions. And again, thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you so much, Professor Jaleel. I mean, I know that was very interesting, and I think we already have one question in the chat here. So Joan asked, does reproduction naturally occur in an industrial setting? And do the male and female die after the reproductive act as they would in the wild? And also, on top of that, are females actually allowed to brood their eggs?
So I'll preface that by saying again, because there is no industrial aquaculture facility right now, and like I said, with the farm in Hawaii, they were actually capturing wild octopuses, so they also weren't breeding them. So we don't actually know the answer to a lot of these questions. We actually don't know how they'll be breeding animals in captivity. That said, if other forms of aquaculture are anything to go by, then no. What ends up happening usually is that there's like a brood stock, and then hatcheries are separate, distinct from farming facilities. So like the aquaculture facilities themselves raise animals from like when they're juveniles to when they reach slaughter weight, but hatcheries are where the breeding happens. So those are probably going to be distinct facilities. But yeah, we actually don't know. I don't have the answer for any of this because like no facility like this exists right now.
Thank you. Yet another reason why octopus farming seems to be pretty difficult. So, do we have any other questions? If not, then before I hand the mic over to Inga, I just had one question. So, when it comes to advocating against octopus farming or testifying before the legislature or any way that you're able to engage in advocacy here, do you think that it is more useful to focus on the health risks that are involved or just in how unique and intelligent octopus are, or both?
That's a great question. I think we've seen with the existing bans that we have, different strategies have worked with different legislatures. Like the California legislature was very open to the, sentience argument. We see the Hawaii legislature does care about the public health risks. I think generally, because laws are man-made, human-made, and because, we do care about the impact of laws on human beings, I think using the public health argument is like, I don't see a problem with it. I think it's always going to be a good hook. But I also think emphasizing the animal welfare and the environmental harms is important because I think for any lobbying or legislative advocacy, you need coalitions, and the more reasons you can put forth, the more likely you are to get allies.
Thank you. And do we have any other questions? Well, I think that was a good question to transition us over to Inga Gibson. So without further ado, I'll hand the mic off.
Oh, thank you. That was an excellent presentation, Dr. Jaleel. Thank you so much for taking the time. And I'm Inga, and I live here in Hawaii. I've been a longtime advocate and lobbyist on animal protection issues, but primarily and most recently on a lot of marine protection issues. I've been working to close down the commercial aquarium pet trade for many, many years and done a lot of advocacy on shark finning and passing a lot of the marine protection issues, including just a couple years ago, we finally enacted a preemptive ban on deep sea mining. So I think that's a great example that we plan to bring up to our legislators because it was pretty much unanimously supported that was also preemptive. We know enough about how destructive ocean mining is and all the environmental and other impacts. We didn't need to wait to have it come to our coast. So I wanted to quickly talk about some of the bills that were referenced. There are two bills that were introduced in the legislature last year. Animal Legal Defense Fund was the lead on those efforts, along with another organization called Animal Rights Initiative. So those bills are still alive because it's the second year of the biennium where bills that are introduced last year have the potential to carry over to this legislative session, which actually starts next week, Wednesday, starts our 60-day legislative session. So those bills passed their first committee, the agriculture committees, in both the House and the Senate. However, they did not meet the deadline to be heard in their second committee, which is the Judiciary Committee in both the House and the Senate. So those bills are technically alive. It's not as common that bills will get picked up. It's more common that new bills get introduced. So that is kind of where we are now, anticipating the possibility of some new bills being introduced. We do have some, I think, tighter language that uses the definitions from the federal bill that Dr. Jaleel spoke about. But I agree, the preamble of the bill explaining the need for the legislation is excellent, talking about the public health, the disease issues, the environmental harms, but importantly here in Hawaii, the he'e, which is our local native octopuses, are culturally significant. So this is a unique issue here in Hawaii. There is a long history genealogy with Kanaloa, with marine creatures, with many marine animals being what we refer to as amakua, or spiritual guardians. So this is an issue that the Native Hawaiian community is also interested in. And we're also the ones that actually brought to my attention the Kanaloa octopus farm that we were able to get shut down some years ago. He'e, octopus, taco is often referred to, is, sorry, I've got rooster right outside my window, is very commonly consumed here. We don't have a large commercial market, but subsistence and recreational fishing is really where, the majority of the he'e are impacted. So unlike Other parts of the country where it is more or less a delicacy, it is really not a staple, but definitely a significant part of the diet, especially for Native Hawaiians and subsistence fishers. So for us, another big point is to emphasize that this would protect the wild populations because of those disease risks. Heaven forbid any aquaculture got started here that could jeopardize those native populations. On a positive note, we do not, unlike I believe many states, we do not have Octopus vulgaris, which I believe is the species that has been most studied for potential aquaculture. So because, sorry, of course he starts crowing right now. Um, because Hawaii is the threatened and endangered species capital of the world, we do have some really good prohibitions on the entry, the import of certain species coming into Hawaii. So right now, vulgaris, because it is not native, um, are prohibited from import. So that's a positive thing. But of course, that doesn't mean that there couldn't be some attempt with our native He'e species, which are the primarily the day octopus, but also we have night octopus. So those are some considerations. The opposition is exactly what Dr. Jaleel spoke about. The slippery slope, that, you know, the foot in the door, that this is just the first step to try to prohibit all animal agriculture, all aquaculture, which is, of course, completely false. And we hear that on just about all of our animal and environmental issues that I work on. So that's nothing new. Also, you know, why preempt? We don't have it going on right now. You know, we have other more important things to work on that are happening now. But absolutely, especially having worked with the aquarium trade and, you know, with shark fishers and others that had become established here, it's just so much more difficult once, you know, a business takes root, because then the argument is jobs, lost jobs, that you're going to be, you know, taking food off these folks' tables if they're not able to work. So we're hopeful that either a new bill will get traction again, that these existing bills will, you know, possibly pick up where they left off. There's also an opportunity here in our state legislature, rather than doing a statutory ban, as to direct the agencies that would oversee aquaculture to promulgate rules, to do administrative rules to prohibit this, that sometimes is more palatable to legislators, not always, but because it's a rule process, which, you know, typically takes years, but that's usually favorable to an outright ban. Our current permitting structure, just quickly, and part of the reason we were able to shut down Kanaloa was right now there are state regulations that prohibit anyone from possessing, capturing, or selling any octopuses under 1 pound. So the fact that Kanaloa was in possession of females with eggs, that in itself made it illegal because of that under 1 pound. In addition, they did not have either of the required permits here for aquaculture or even aquaculture research, a special activity permit, which is strictly for non-commercial activities, or an aquaculture facilities license, which is for commercial. So that was another way that we were able to get the department to issue a cease and desist letter and shut them down. They were not conducting any kind of legitimate research. There were attempts at bobtail squid and creating some kind of feed potentially for octopuses, but generally, just like Dr. Jaleel said, it was, you know, it was a petting zoo. Basically, they were making hand over fist, charging naive tourists $50 a head, running tour groups 5 times a day of 25 people, 7 days a week, just making hundreds of thousands of dollars off the backs of our, you know, culturally significant and really important animals. There was no legitimate research. So they are closed down. There's nothing, unfortunately, except for those permitting processes and prohibitions on certain other species to stop someone else from attempting the same. They were not able to successfully close the life cycle, also as mentioned. And so that, you know, obviously would mean many, many, many years of research potentially, but obviously we know enough now about these species to not want to see that happen. And in closing, I'll just say the precautionary principle is the foundation of our of Hawaii. When we don't know enough, or with what we do know, we always err on the side of caution because it's really too great of a threat to Hawaii and our very, very existing fragile marine environment. So I'll be working with Animal Welfare Institute this session on this measure, along with many other groups in Savannah. I'm so glad that the Hawaii State Bar Association is interested and involved in this issue. So I can provide my email or Savannah can pass along my information. So thank you all so very much. Appreciate the opportunity to talk
Thank you so much,
or
Inga.
answer questions.